Hello, and welcome to Larry Talks. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Dean Doyle, and I'm really happy to have you here tonight. Whether you're here listening during your commute, a quiet moment at home, or somewhere in between, thank you for choosing the time to spend with me. So take a breath, grab a cup of coffee or a glass of tea, get comfortable, and let's get into today's session. The story tonight opens with a simple truth. A federal court ordered the Department of Defense to preserve every herbicide-related record under MDL 381. That order was binding. It overrode internal policies, retention schedules, and convenience. It required identification, preservation, chain of custody, and proper transfer of NARA with accession metadata. Yet across the Army, Navy, Air Force, and OSDJS, or Department of Defense, the record shows something very different. FOIA requests vanish without acknowledgement. Tracking numbers appear and disappear. Offices contradict each other inside the same service. Requests are returned, a category that doesn't exist in FOIA. Referrals are made without accession numbers, making them impossible to follow. No records response are issued for categories of records that could not legally have been destroyed. Requests are never docketed. Searches are never documented. And when the subject matter is herbicides, the pattern repeats across every component. That is not bureaucracy. It is a culture of acting as if accountability is optional. It is a system behaving as though a federal preservation order never existed, and it is happening in agencies that are not intelligence agencies that are legally required to operate transparently. When the top treats MDL 381 as an inconvenience instead of a binding order, the message that filters down is predictable. Don't preserve more than you have to. Don't dig too deep. Don't create discoverable paper trails, and if someone asks, send them somewhere else. The consequences are visible everywhere. Planes that should have been preserved as evidence were destroyed. Herbicide barrels were sent to smelters. Disposal records that should exist do not. FOIA offices issue contradictory statements 2 days apart. Requests are lost between Fort Belvoir and Fort Detrick. Navy components disagree about who received a request and when. OSDJS never acknowledges a request at all. These are not isolated errors. They are the downstream effects of a system that decided long ago that herbicide records were a liability, not a legal obligation. And while the system protected itself, veterans and families paid the price. People exposed to herbicides were told no records exist. Claims were denied because the evidence was lost. Communities lived on contaminated land without answers. Families buried loved ones without ever knowing the truth. Taxpayers funded cleanup, medical care, and litigation that should never have been necessary. When agencies ignore a federal preservation order, they aren't just breaking procedure, they're breaking trust. They're breaking people. Public needs to hear that the failures are not abstract. They are not clerical. They are not harmless. They are the reason a veteran sits across from a claims officer and hears, "We have no evidence you were exposed." They are a reason that a widow receives a denial letter instead of an apology. They are the reason communities in Okinawa, Vietnam, and the United States still live with unanswered questions. They are the reason the truth about herbicide operations has remained fragmented, contradictory, and buried under decades of institutional avoidance. A podcast that tells this story can show listeners how a federal preservation order was ignored, how FOIA systems collapsed across multiple components, how agencies acted as if they were above the law, and how those decisions shaped the lives of real people. It can show that when institutions decide they don't have to follow the rules, the cost is measured in human suffering, not paperwork. It can remind the country that transparency is not optional, that accountability is not a courtesy, and that the rule of law only works when every part of the system respects it. If you think this doesn't touch your life because you never wore a uniform, never set foot on a base, never handled a drum of herbicide, and never served in Okinawa, think again. The same chemicals the government mishandled overseas were later repackaged, rebranded, and sold to American farmers, homeowners, groundskeepers, and entire communities as everyday products. The same compound that sickens veterans were sprayed on fields, fence lines, schoolyards, and backyards across this country for decades. Monsanto didn't stop after Vietnam. They shifted from military contracts to consumer markets, and the chemicals followed. Farmers and farm families were exposed season after season, often without warning, often without protective gear, and often without any understanding of what was in the tank. Many of the same illnesses that show up in Okinawa veterans, neurological disorders, cancers, autoimmune conditions, show up in rural America too. Parkinson's disease, in particular, has been tied to long-term exposure to these herbicides. That's not speculation. That's documented case law and medical literature. People who never served a day in uniform are living with the same consequences as those who did. And it wasn't just farms. Look at Times Beach, Missouri. A whole community poisoned by dioxin-contaminated waste oil sprayed on their roads. Families forced to abandon their homes. The federal government had to buy the entire town and relocate every resident. The soil was so contaminated, it had to be incinerated. That wasn't a battlefield. That was a neighborhood. Children rode their bikes on those streets. Parents walked their dogs. People lived their lives on top of the same chemicals the government now pretends never existed in Okinawa. Meanwhile, society has been conditioned to blame Vietnam veterans for their own exposure. You weren't really near it. You can't prove it. The records don't exist. It was too long ago. The VA denies claims not because the science isn't there, but because the paper trail was allowed to rot or was never preserved in the first place. Veterans are told their illnesses are coincidence, while civilians exposed to the same compounds are quietly compensated through class action settlements. This is the human cost of a system that decided it didn't have to follow the rules. When agencies ignore preservation orders, when records disappear, when FOIA collapses, the truth doesn't just vanish from filing cabinets, it vanishes from people's lives. Veterans lose benefits, families lose answers, communities lose their health, and the country loses trust in the institutions meant to protect it. The thing I find odd about this entire process is how every agency I deal with seems to be working from the same playbook. The same answers, the same excuses, the same habits that let them deny that they had the very records I'm asking for. They fail to log a request in. They wait until I ask why I haven't heard from them, and only then do they suddenly discover the request and log it in. They deny responsibility for records. They claim the records were only kept 6 years and then destroyed. And here's the problem. I play by the rules. I craft tight, ironclad FOIA requests that leave them very little room to maneuver. And they don't play by the rules at all. And that's where Judge Weinstein's preservation order comes in. Issued in 1979, still in force, and still binding. That order makes their excuses impossible. They can't claim the records were destroyed after 6 years. They can't claim they never had them. They can't claim that they aren't responsible. The court already anticipated all those excuses nearly 50 years ago. Just today, I discovered that I'd filed a request with an agency on October 25th, 2025. After hearing nothing, I refiled it on January 4th, 2026. And here we are in February, still nothing. That's the kind of game they play. Delay, deny, hope I get tired, hope I go away. What they don't understand, but they are slowly learning, is that I don't go away. I don't stop. I don't quit. I will keep going until I have solved this to my satisfaction. What I know is this. Hundreds of veterans have described leaking barrels of herbicides buried all over Okinawa. Those barrels did not bury themselves. Someone handled them, someone moved them, and someone put them in the ground. The official narrative pretends those stories are folklore, but the physical evidence and the documentary records say otherwise. I know and can prove that Agent Orange was shipped to the Machinado Supply Depot in 1966 from Chicago. That shipment alone destroys the claim that no tactical herbicides ever passed through Okinawa. I know that 33 barrels were dug up at the soccer field outside Kitty Air Base, and the chemical analysis confirmed what veterans have been saying for decades. I know that ranch hand aircraft were put through corrosion control on Okinawa, and corrosion control meant washing down the aircraft and stripping the paint. Today, we understand that dioxin doesn't wash away. The stripped paint and contaminated wash water went straight into the ground, into the sewer system, and eventually into the groundwater in the ocean. I know that in 1962, 2 cattle died on Okinawa after a man from the chemical company sprayed the ditches earlier that day. When he learned the cattle had died, he paid the farmers. That is not the behavior of someone applying a harmless weed killer. I know that Lieutenant Colonel Elia wrote his report. He listed the spray as herbicide, using the same terminology that appears throughout the Vietnam era chemical operations documents. And I know this, regardless of the official narrative, there was herbicide residue on Okinawa. There is herbicide residue on Okinawa. The soil, the water, the barrels, the aircraft maintenance records, the shipping documents, the eyewitness accounts, all that converge on the same truth. The only thing that doesn't line up is the government's story. If this interests you, you're going to want to tune in tomorrow. Last week, I received the training material for doctors entering the Veterans Administration. I'm not going to give away the whole packet yet, but I will say this. It is a blueprint for systemic minimization of exposure, not medical science, not clinical guidance, a blueprint. The language in that packet doesn't teach healthcare workers how to diagnose exposure. It teaches them how not to diagnose exposure. It frames exposure as unlikely. It frames veteran testimony as unreliable. It frames environmental evidence as irrelevant. And it signals, quietly but unmistakably, that the safest path for a VA healthcare worker is to avoid diagnosing exposure altogether. When you put that training packet next to the evidence on the ground, next to the shipping records, next to the barrels, next to the corrosion control procedures, next to the eyewitness accounts, next to the chemical analysis, the contrast is impossible to ignore. The truth is, in the soil, in the water, the denial is in the training. As I wrap up today's episode, I hope it gave you something to think about, and maybe even something to carry with you and think about. If this session resonated with you, please feel free to share it with a veteran or a dependent who is suffering, or someone that might need to hear it, or someone who may be interested in this topic. And don't forget to click on the follow icon so you don't miss future episodes and sessions.